Well, good afternoon to you. It is 5:06 here, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. Coming up, Gregg Pemberton joins us this hour. Do not miss this conversation. He's the chairman of the D.C. Police Union. We'll get his reaction to one councilman saying it's time to call in the National Guard because of all of the homicides in D.C. And another councilman who is responding by saying, no, we don't need the National Guard. We need to give more resources to the cops. Here's a secret, though. That same councilman was cutting resources for the cops. It's insanity in the nation's capital, as always. You can join us today, 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Yes, the nation's capital. As they say in Monty Python, it's a silly place. And it has ridiculous people in charge, corrupt people in charge. And in fact, that's the subject of our next conversation, too. Julie Kelly is the author of the Declassified by Julie Kelly Substack. You should definitely subscribe to that. And she's the author of the book, How Democrats Use the Capitol Protest to Launch a War on Terror Against the Political Right. Julie, great to have you back with us.
Hey, Vince. Thanks so much for having me on.
The District of Columbia and the federal government here, the judges here, the grand juries here, is the subject of some debate this week because down in Florida, Judge Aileen Cannon has basically told the special counsel Jack Smith, as he goes after Trump and the people who work for him, that you need to explain yourself here. Why are you using a D.C. grand jury when everything involved here is down in Florida? What are you hiding exactly? Julie, what do you make of all of this?
Well, I will say God bless Judge Aileen Cannon. You know, she has DOJ's number, and she was the judge who appointed a special master, a third party, to vet all of the evidence that the FBI stole from Mar-a-Lago a year ago. Donald Trump filed a lawsuit seeking this third party not trusting the DOJ to be truthful in the handling of that evidence. She concurred and said that based on DOJ's leaks to the media, the unprecedented nature of the case, and also mishandling of some of that evidence early on, that she thought that a third party was necessary. Now, that ruling was overturned, unfortunately, but she is not suffering any fools at DOJ, Jack Smith, or his lead prosecutor there, in that case, Jay Bratt. So what she did yesterday is she denied Jack Smith's attempt to conceal two filings in her court, and also suggested that the defense, Trump's team, should inquire as to why not only the D.C. grand jury, who conducted the entire investigation, then Jack Smith switched it to Florida at the last minute because realizing they'd have a venue issue, but the D.C. grand jury is still investigating the Mar-a-Lago case, even though there's no crime alleged to have taken place in Washington, D.C. So we're anxious to see how Trump's team responds to that.
Yes.
But she is very aware of the chicanery going on in that case.
And what Jack Smith was able to do in D.C. with this grand jury was he was able to kick open all sorts of doors that he may not have been able to do in other jurisdictions, including apparently piercing the attorney-client privilege of the President of the United States and forcing his attorneys to testify against their own client by getting it signed off by D.C. Judge Beryl Howell in D.C. And again, all of this happening out of sight of Florida, where this is the jurisdiction where all of this is alleged to have taken place.
Right. So it's important to remind people that a grand jury is made up of the same people who would make up a trial jury, and that is voters in a city that elected Joe Biden, voted 93% for Joe Biden, have open contempt for Trump supporters, and particularly those involved in the events of January 6th.
Yes.
So they allowed Chief Judge Beryl Howell, an Obama-appointed judge, another one, who also oversaw Robert Mueller's special counsel investigation. They went to her to get this pierce this attorney-client privilege. She did this under a sealed order, claiming the crime fraud exception, that somehow the attorney Evan Corcoran was involved in a crime, and so pierced that privilege, forced Evan Corcoran to testify to the D.C. grand jury and produce all of his documents, recordings, notes, etc. She also signed off on a subpoena to get months of security footage from Mar-a-Lago. Think about that, Vince. Not only piercing attorney-client privilege between a former president and his lawyer, but forcing Donald Trump to turn over months of security footage from inside his own home. They have the equivalent of 3 years of footage, 9 months from different camera angles that are now involved in that case. That's exactly why DOJ and then Jack Smith conducted this entire investigation in D.C. to get those sort of favorable rulings that they probably wouldn't have gotten in the Southern District of Florida.
It's amazing. So, it all strikes me, not being a lawyer here, it all strikes me as the kind of thing that would be innately unconstitutional, though. You have a right to an unbiased jury. It's a Sixth Amendment right. You have a right to that. You have a right to a jury of your peers. And what we have here is a corrupted D.C. grand jury in a very partisan district cooking up all sorts of ways to violate Donald Trump's civil liberties and then handing off their work product to Florida and hoping that the judge just rubber stamps it down there. I mean, it all seems so thoroughly corrupt.
It does, and that's why you have federal prosecutors who are calling this out, and of course, Judge Cannon has as well. And the defense attorneys in a hearing last month also told Judge Cannon that they were going to pursue an abuse of grand jury motion in this matter, along with other motions. So there's a very strong possibility if the defense attorneys in this case, in the Mar-a-Lago matter, file to dismiss the case entirely, there's a very good chance that Judge Cannon will. I suspect Jack Smith will be relieved because this case is so weak. They're trying to keep everything under wraps, even keeping evidence away from Donald Trump himself. So that's a mess over there, but Judge Cannon seems to have a good handle on it. That's why you see the legal experts, the Andrew Weissmans of the world going nuts. This landed in her courtroom because they know she's not going to tolerate this bad behavior from DOJ.
There's a full court press right now to delegitimize Judge Aileen Cannon as well, because they're constantly saying that she's somehow a Trump stooge, that she's Trump appointed, she's a Trump judge, she's Trump's favorite judge, and so therefore her legal rulings are irrelevant because they're all colored by her prejudice towards Trump. What do you make of all of that?
Well, of course, that's exactly why, and she really earned the ire of the left and the MSNBC legal analyst types when she appointed that special master. And of course, they crowed and were so happy when she was overturned by her own circuit on that. But contrast that with the media's portrayal of Judge Tanya Chutkan, an Obama-appointed judge who hands down some of the harshest sentences in January 6 cases,
yes,
also authored a pivotal landmark decision to deny Trump executive privilege claims and forcing him to turn over records to the January 6 committee. So she's heavily biased and already has her fingerprints all over this abusive January 6 prosecution, not just against regular Americans, but Donald Trump himself. But no one is raising any conflict of interest matters related to Tanya Chutkan. She is a hero now because, as we already see, she's violating her court's usual protocol of 14 days to respond to a government motion. She cut that down to 2 days when it came to Donald Trump.
Yes.
So she's already making her moves as well.
Yeah, Judge Tanya Chutkan, by the way, in terms of her conflicts, she worked at the same law firm that Hunter Biden was employed by. So this is,
right.
And we're all supposed to be like, oh, that's totally normal. And then you turn around and Aileen Cannon is not allowed to, render judgments as a judge because Donald Trump appointed her.
Right. So it's just more hypocrisy, especially by the news media. And, at the same time that they're protecting Tanya Chutkan and defending her and swooning over her, now forcing Trump's hand so early on this protective order motion by the government, really going after Aileen Cannon. But Aileen Cannon is tough. And it does not appear that she has been bowed at all by the criticism. In fact, I think that she has a very good grasp of what she's up against. She was born in Colombia. Her mother fled communist Cuba as a child. So my sense is she understands what this country is up against and what this Biden regime and DOJ is attempting to do, not just to Donald Trump, but to the country.
There is let me ask, because you follow a lot of these court proceedings really closely, whether it's in Trump's case or in Hunter Biden's case or the January 6th trials. And something I've noticed lately is that suddenly there's a number of federal judges who have decided they've had enough of this crap. Among them is Judge Cannon, who we're talking about. There's also the judge that heard the Hunter plea deal, Mary Ellen Noreika. She said, wait a second, you're giving him blanket immunity and you're doing it in a separate document that I'm not allowed to sign off on? I don't think so. And she slammed the brakes on that case. There was also the case of Judge Terry Doty of the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Louisiana. He stepped up and said, wait a second, the Biden administration can't use social media companies to censor American speech. You're going to put a stop to that immediately. Do you think that these judges are finding their intestinal fortitude? Do you sense a sea change right now?
I do, and all three of them are very courageous because we see what this regime, this national security apparatus, and the news media are capable of doing when they put someone in their crosshairs. So all three of those judges are so courageous. Contrast that to the weaklings, the compliant rubber stamp judges on the D.C. District and Circuit Court who've acted as nothing more, they'll just sign whatever DOJ and Jack Smith puts in front of them, and they have for 2.5 years. And this is judges appointed by Trump, appointed by Ronald Reagan, believe it or not. These are Republican judges as well. And it was shocking, Vince, last Thursday during the arraignment, you had at least 4 federal judges of the D.C. District Court sitting in the courtroom when Donald Trump was arraigned. How inappropriate is that? Why was Amy Berman Jackson in the courtroom? She was the judge in the Roger Stone case. They're almost there, to mock the president.
They're there to taunt him.
They are there to taunt him, to show how powerful, unaccountably powerful they are. And I'll tell you, Vince, I urge some Republicans to impeach at least one judge on the D.C. District Court. Pick any of them. I could name a Trump judge. It could be Beryl Howell. It could be Amy Berman, any of them. And of course, they wouldn't do it. I can't remember the last time a federal judge was impeached. So that's why they know their authority is unchallenged and unaccountable, and why these 3 judges really stand out as our country is under assault by this DOJ and the federal judges in D.C.
Yeah. One last question for you about D.C. specifically. The D.C. U.S. Attorney is a man called Matthew Graves. I know you're super familiar with him. Right now, we are having a big conversation about the surge in yet more homicides in D.C. D.C. is a unique district in the country because local crime in D.C. is handled by the U.S. Attorney. That is Matthew Graves. And last year, according to some counts, 67% of all arrests went unprosecuted by the U.S. Attorney, Matthew Graves. What do you think, when you look at all of these headlines about crime in D.C., how much responsibility does the U.S. Attorney's Office have here?
I think a lot of responsibility, because he has that 67% declination rate, they call it. So more than 2/3 of the cases that police bring to the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, he declines to prosecute. At the same time, Vince, they're still charging people every week. I get alerts almost every day that the FBI has arrested another January 6th defendant, and I get these announcements from the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office. This is Matthew Graves' focus. He is a Biden appointee. His wife runs a very large, influential left-wing nonprofit in D.C. She has visited the White House almost more than 30 times since her husband was appointed D.C. U.S. Attorney. So it's very clear Matthew Graves, like Jack Smith, have their marching orders, and the safety of the residents and the tourists in Washington, D.C. Apparently is of no concern to Matthew Graves, because he's still rounding up Trump supporters who walked into the Capitol building for 5 minutes more than 2.5 years ago.
It's totally evil. Julie Kelly, thank you very much for keeping your eyes on this all the time and bringing us the details. Thank you, Julie. Good to talk to you today. Yeah, over 16 people have already died in the District of Columbia in August alone due to homicides. Here's a report from WUSA 9 on a shooting that took place Saturday in Adams Morgan.
It has been a violent 24 hours in the district. 4 of our neighbors are dead and 3 others hurt after a string of shootings. One of those shootings in Adams Morgan killed 2 men, and another is said to be fighting for his life in the hospital. It happened last night at Ontario and Euclid Streets near the Line Hotel. Our Katie Kairos spoke with witnesses at the scene.
I heard this popping noise, and it was like 10 or 15 like different pops. When I realized, I'm like, that's like, it sounded like a balloon, but then I realized, I'm like, that's a gunshot. And then I saw people running. So I kind of like ran down the alley.
Gunshots ringing out in Adams Morgan, just 1 block from the Line Hotel at about 1 a.m. Brian Calevra was walking to meet a friend in the midst of a busy Friday night when he heard the shots and ran along with a crowd of people.
And I kind of hid under a dumpster, and I just stayed there. And I called 911. And she goes, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm fine," but I was a little taken aback. I mean, it scared the heck out of me. You know what I mean? It was like really kind of scary.
Police say 2 men died at the scene at Euclid and Ontario. A 3rd man was transferred to a hospital. Both roads remained closed for hours. Neighbors woke up and made their way through crime scene tape.
Yeah, it's not a scene that you normally saw in Northwest D.C., but unfortunately becoming a little bit more common. All of this violence spreading around the city. And it's led some council members to say enough is enough. One saying it's time to bring in the National Guard. What's actually going to solve this problem? We're going to be joined by Gregg Pemberton, the head of the D.C. Police Union, coming up just minutes away. We are going to ask him about today's breaking news out of the D.C. Council. Stay with us. Good afternoon to you. It is 5:34 here on News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. You can join us. 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Concern about crime in Washington, D.C. Over 16 people already shot dead this month, August. Councilman Trayon White, always a bit of a wild card. He's with Ward 8. It's a violent ward in Washington, D.C. And here's what he had to say today at a press conference.
Just this summer, we have had 12 kids shot in the District of Columbia. And almost a dozen youth and young adults shot in our community as well. And we're here today standing in solidarity saying enough is enough.
Enough is enough. So what's going to happen?
I know those who live here know that we are clearly in a war zone.
Absolutely.
I'm going to say it again. We are clearly in a war zone. If you don't know you are in a war zone, that means you haven't been here.
A war zone. That's a hell of a place to live. And Ward 8, certainly in the middle of one, no question.
7D Police Department are down 33 officers in Ward 8 when the crime is the highest ever been in the last 20 years. We're in the process of uploading almost 300 officers by the end of this year. But guess what? The data reflects that by the time we upload 300 officers, new officers, inexperienced officers, we're going to lose almost 352 officers. We are in a shortage of officers in D.C.
In other words, we need more cops.
Last year, the Metropolitan Police Department hired 37 officers back in the police department who were fired due to negligence and irresponsible behavior. But guess what? They were hired back. That means they are back in uniform, serving in the city that told them we don't want them anymore. But because their union is so strong, we have to deal with it with no repercussions. And the government had to pay $14.3 million in back pay. And we can't depend upon the police department to police our community.
All right, so you hear him saying a couple different things. One is we don't have enough cops, but then some of the people that they hired back, they shouldn't have hired them. It's kind of all over the place. So let's dig through it with our next guest. Gregg Pemberton, the chairman of the D.C. Police Union, joins us now. Gregg, good to have you back with us, sir.
Vince, thanks for having me. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing well. Help me sort through what you hear Trayon White say here. It sounds like, on one hand, he definitely supports having more cops in place to help bring about a peace in the city that's desperately needed. On the other hand, he is suggesting that you and the union have brought back cops who shouldn't be in those jobs. What do you make of all of that?
Well, I think you might need longer than a 3-hour show to sort through whatever that was that he was saying just now. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Let's break it down. First of all, we are short cops. I don't know where those numbers he's citing come from. They don't make a lot of sense to me. But we are short about 500 police officers right now citywide, and I'm sure that he's feeling that in Ward 8 and the citizens that are there with him are. And it really is correct that it's a war zone. I mean, it's absolute bedlam and mayhem out there when you look at the crime stats. We're at 161 homicides this year, which is a 20% increase over last year's significant uptick in crime. So he's right about that. And the problem is that he's the one that broke it. And it's through the city council's action in passing the 2022 Policing and Justice Reform Act, which is what drove 1,200 police officers out of the department and has rendered us absolutely incapable of hiring anything to replace those numbers. I don't know what his offhanded comment about people who were rehired by the police department. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But the fact of the matter is that we are short cops, and that's the main reason why his ward looks like a war zone. And the reason that we're short cops is because he passed a mountain of terrible legislation that prevents us from doing our job.
Let me play another piece of audio from Trayon White today. He says he's been saying that he thinks it might be time to bring in the National Guard to help establish a peace in the city. Here he is saying that at the press conference.
So I have spoken with the D.C. National Guard. And while I have to have more conversations with the chief of police, which I have today, and the mayor and my colleagues, we have a long way to get there. We just know that police alone is not getting it done. I saw the shooting video of Nia Courtney, who was shot on Martin Luther King Avenue and Malcolm X. Think about the irony of that. On Martin Luther King, intersecting Malcolm X, we had 5 people shot. One was a little girl. And guess what I saw in that video? The police sitting right there. There was a shooting. I won't even want to say a shooting. There were 3 shootings this summer at funerals. And one funeral, guess what I saw in the video? The police sitting right there.
Gregg Pemberton, what do you make of this? He's calling for the D.C. National Guard, now suggesting in the same breath that police aren't enough alone to get the job done and that cops stand by as violence is afflicting the city.
Yeah, it really is a scatterbrained set of comments. I mean, first of all, the National Guard, they're wonderful people. They do great work. When they are called out, they're typically called out for civil disturbance or special events like an inauguration or the 4th of July. They have been called out before in times where crime is high, but they're really used as a visual deterrent. These people, even though they have arrest powers, they don't investigate crime. They're not going to go to the scene of a shooting and try to investigate who committed that offense. They're not detectives. And that's not the kind of solution that we need right now. What he's complaining about is that the police officers don't have the ability to get out and do their job the way they used to. And the reason that that's the case is because of the bills that he's passed since he's been sitting on the council. And the way for them to fix that, they could literally do it overnight. They could pass an emergency legislation that repeals the Policing and Justice Reform Act of 2022, submit that to the chief, and have these police officers doing work. We could get these numbers down in 30 to 60 days. But one thing that's interesting is he points out that he sees these videos of these shootings and there's a police officer right there. That's not an indictment of the police not doing their job. That's an indictment of how brazen criminals are, because they know even if that police officer gets out and arrests them, there's no consequence for that because prosecutors and judges won't hold them accountable for committing that crime even when they're convicted. And that's the other part of the problem. And until people like Trayon White and the rest of the city council realize that what they've done is they've completely destroyed criminal justice in the city, I don't think that this problem is going to get solved anytime soon.
Congress tried to solve it.
By the National Guard.
Congress tried to solve it earlier this week. They tried to repeal that Comprehensive Policing and Justice Reform Amendment Act of 2022, which you mentioned. Joe Biden vetoed it. You think that was a mistake?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. We did a lot of work lobbying the House, and we got bipartisan support in the House and in the Senate to repeal that bill. They saw the detrimental policies that existed in there. Unfortunately, when it went down the street to Pennsylvania Avenue, President Biden didn't see it the same way, and he vetoed the bill to repeal it, which meant that the bill ultimately went into effect. And the city council rejoiced that decision, and they hailed Joe Biden as a hero for doing that. And now here we are with the same group of people throwing their hands in the air saying, how could this possibly have happened? Chairman Mendelson came out earlier this week and he said, well, I need the police to come to me and tell me what it is they need. This is just an absolutely laughable statement. I mean, we have testified in every public hearing that has anything to do with policing. We've submitted written and oral testimony. We've met with them. We've met with their staffs. I've even taken them to coffee before to sit down and try to explain to them what the intended and unintended consequences of these policies are. And we've laid this out in every day that we have an opportunity. We've given them exactly the tools we need, which is for them to repeal these measures that handcuff cops. And now they want to stand up here and say, well, we don't know what it is you need. It's really preposterous, and it's just terrible flip-flop rhetoric from the city council.
Isn't DC Council Chairman Phil Mendelson, wasn't he responsible for cutting resources for cops? And now he's saying that we need to be giving the Metropolitan Police Department all the resources they need?
Yeah, this is a group of people that were very loudly supporting the defund the police movement. These are people that moved to reduce the budget of the police department, to reduce the scope of police officers, to reduce the physical size of the police department. And they fought hard to do that all through 2020 and 2021. And finally, when these bills passed in 2022 and were implemented into law and we started to see the crime going off the rails, they've since backed away from that position, and now they want to pretend like that never happened. And unfortunately, we have the receipts, and we're going to show them that it is their fault. And hopefully the voters see the same thing, because the only way to fix this is going to be to get council members elected that care about public safety and care about the police department.
How just to back things up for a moment, how desperate is the situation now when it comes to violent crime in D.C.?
This is the worst I've ever seen it in my nearly 20 years of being on this department, and even people that have been on significantly longer say the same thing. A lot of people say, well, it was worse in the 90s. I think we're starting to look a lot like the city did during those times. I mean, we're on pace, I think, mathematically to surpass 250 homicides this year. These are numbers that are really catastrophic. And I think one of the main problems that I point to regularly that no one seems to be discussing or trying to solve is that every month for the past 5 years, we have posted a negative net loss of police officers. And, there's a lot of debate about, well, how many people should be on the department? Should it be 3,500? Should it be 4,000? These arguments are completely moot because we're losing officers every month. And if you run that timeline out, at some point it's going to get to zero. And this is not something that you can change overnight. And the fact that no one's talking about it right now means that it's not going to be solved for years. And I think by the time the city council and others that are in its orbit realize, hey, this is a real problem, it's really going to be too late to turn this thing around. Go ahead.
What is the primary factor in the attrition rate, would you say?
The bill that the city council passed, which completely eliminates the due process rights of police officers. It eliminates all equitability and fairness in the disciplinary system. It changes the use of force policy so that investigators can sort of armchair or Monday morning quarterback the issues rather than using the Supreme Court guidance on use of force. Increases the Office of Police Complaints ability to investigate and discipline police officers even when they don't have the evidence, that the preponderance of the evidence to do so. It really creates an environment that it's almost impossible to be a police officer and to be able to go out and do responsible policing.
And it stacks the deck against the cops and in favor of the criminals for sure. Because like an example that always sticks out to me is that by virtue of the law you and I are talking about, DC cops are not allowed to reflect on their own body camera footage when preparing their police report. They can't look at the camera footage that was on their body in order to compile their police report. They're expected not to look at it. And if there's any discrepancy between the two things, the film and the memory of the cop, the case, obviously gets thrown out. The criminal defendant gets away with it, and that's courtesy of this stupidity built into that law.
Well, and just to add to that, Vince, you're absolutely right. And the judges will label the police officers as liars, and so will the prosecutors, rendering them unable to testify in the future. And so now officers are very reluctant to be as descriptive as they want to be in these reports, because they're concerned that some frame of video that's paused 6 months later when they're in the trial may not match up exactly with what they wrote in the report, and they'll be lambasted by the court for that. And this is exactly right. I mean, listen, there's 26 subtitles in this. I certainly don't have time to get into them all, but I can assure you that every single one of them hamstrings police officers from being able to go out and do their job in a professional, responsible way. And until they repeal that law, there's no way that these numbers are going anywhere, either the staffing numbers or the crime numbers. We're going to continue to see these problems until they get rid of that bill.
What role does U.S. Attorney Matthew Graves, the U.S. Attorney for D.C., play in all of this?
Well, he plays a big part, because the cases that the officers are making, when the officers are going out and making arrests, or detectives are typing up warrants and getting people arrested on probable cause for these violent crimes, the vast majority of those cases are not being papered, is the term that we use, which means bring charges. When the officers bring the case into the U.S. Attorney's office, they're being dismissed. And the argument that's being given is, well, we only take cases that have prosecutorial merit. But that's completely sort of ignoring the idea that there's this grand jury process where most of the investigation gets done, and that happens after the arrest, when officers and detectives get subpoena power and bring in witnesses and show evidence and make a case in the grand jury and indict people. That's where we really strengthen our cases. What Mr. Graves is saying is that he's evaluating the case on that sort of initial probable cause document, and he's just no papering it, meaning that he's dismissing it outright. And until we start to see those no paper rates, as we call them, decrease and the charging rates go up, most criminals aren't going to be held accountable.
Do cops have a habit in D.C. of arresting people who aren't committing crimes? Is that what's happening?
Not that I'm aware of, because I'm pretty sure that all of these disciplinary and complaint and investigative systems and 9 other agencies that investigate police behavior would have a field day with that.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And it's the only thing you'd be reading about. It'd be on the cover of the Washington Post every day.
Yeah, yet Matthew Graves turned down prosecutions of 67% of all cases last year. And too much violent crime happening in the city, and a prosecutor nowhere to be found, unfortunately. Thank you very much, Gregg Pemberton. As always, good to talk to you. Really appreciate your insight today, sir. We'll have to dig into this in some greater detail in the future, but obviously the topic's not going to go away. But I noticed my buddy Jazz Shaw over at Hot Air was writing about the phenomenon of AI girlfriends. Apparently people are signing up on the internet to chat with like a woman. It's not a woman. It's a computer dressed as a woman. It's what is that? A transgender computer? What are we dealing with here? And they say AI ethicists are now warning, and women's rights activists are warning, that some men are beginning to develop one-sided relationships with their computer, in that they're abusing the women involved because they feel no obligation because there are no women involved. It's a computer. They feel no obligation to the computer as a human female, so they treat them like garbage, and then they learn these, which is nuts, and then they learn these like abusive thoughts. They begin to develop a pattern of abuse towards women. That's what they're concerned about. I'm more broadly concerned. Yeah, abuse I think could be one of the impacts of this, but I'm also concerned just about human relationships. If you're going to sub in a computer for women entirely, and then you're just like, I don't need women anymore, doesn't that really destroy a society, right? What has happened with the government getting involved with, basically being the head of household and saying that people don't need to get married anymore, have as many children as you want, you don't need a mother and a father in the house, everything will be fine. Has that worked out for us as a country? No. The answer to that is no. You don't have to do a lot of research to establish the answer to that question. Now we're going to have another way to eliminate the use for your fellow human being for the opposite sex. Yeah, that sounds good. That sounds like the bigger risk, I would say, than just the, John abuses his computer problem, which is a problem. I just think that in terms of scale, might not be quite as big as we don't need each other anymore. Let's all crash and burn. Could be an issue. I'll leave you with that happy thought. The great one, Mark Levin, is up next right here on WMAL.